Welcome to this presentation on the Informus Food Prices module. I'm Dr. Sally Mackay, a registered nutritionist from the University of Auckland, and I'll be presenting this with my colleague, Dr. Merryn Lewis from the University of Queensland in Australia. And we would like to acknowledge the module creator, Professor Amanda Lee. So I'm going to give a brief overview and talk about the policy implications of monitoring food prices, talk about two of the common approaches that we use in Informus, the minimal approach, which looks at prices, and the optimal approach, which looks at the affordability of diets. Merryn will give some examples of using the optimal approach and talk about different sources of food price data, and then I will talk about some recent work where we've added sustainability measures. So some of the different policy reasons for monitoring the cost of food and diets is the data can be used for modelling the effects of taxes or subsidies. For example, if there's a proposal to remove a tax from fruits and vegetables, then with the model diets, you can have a look at how much would people actually save if that tax was or subsidy was put in place. We can look at differences across regions. For example, large countries where there might be rural and remote areas might have very different prices and costs of diets compared to other regions. And likewise, we can look at the affordability of food for different population groups, and Merryn will talk more about that. It's important to consider the feasibility of following new advice. For example, there is a lot of talk about healthy and sustainable diets, but we need to know, are these affordable and accessible for the population? And so monitoring the price of foods and diets can help us with that. Now, as you will be aware, there are lots of different types of prices that can make an impact on the cost of diets. For example, discounts are very common in supermarkets. Many supermarkets have generic brands, and these can be a lot cheaper than the branded products, and so having a model diet or prices can mean that you can look at the effects of the different types of diets. So with Informus, we have three different approaches. The first one is the minimal approach, which is usually the one with the least resources, so the easiest to do. And this looks at prices. So it looks at price changes over time. And I'll come back to another slide to emphasize it's important to do this over time rather than just cross-sectionally. So price changes of healthy foods and unhealthy foods, or however a country chooses to categorize the foods. The meals approach, or the extended approach, compares the cost of common takeaway meals with their healthy homemade counterparts. And this is an approach that is not recommended as much as the other two because it's not so useful for policies. I did explore this approach with my PhD and did find that often healthy homemade counterparts were actually cheaper than the common takeaway meals in New Zealand. And I also looked at the cost of meal preparation time. But unless you've got a specific policy question, it's probably not the module or the approach that I would recommend. And then the optimal approach is looking at diets, because this is actually the way that people combine food. And so ideally, this is what you would do in your country. So this is comparing the cost and affordability of healthy and the less healthy current diets. And there are a number of other scenarios that you can have a look at too. And I will look at these when I talk more about adding sustainability measures. So looking at the minimal approach, I'm going to give you some examples of how this has been done in other countries. So in New Zealand, we are lucky in that our Consumer Price Index has a monthly publication of the food prices of 150 common foods. So I've looked at these and classified them as healthy and unhealthy, and also separately by level of processing, and then analyse the changes over time. And Mexico have done this recently, and you can see a publication at the bottom of this slide that looks at their data. Some countries have good household budget survey information, and Brazil particularly has a number of publications where they have used this. So one of their publications looked at households and the mean prices of foods and beverage purchased at supermarkets compared to other food stores. They've also looked at the association between the price of ultra-processed foods, and then looked at risk factors such as overweight and obesity. And then also looking at the energy share of processed or the different levels of processed foods, and other countries have done this as well. So these are just some of the ways that you can look at food prices. Now, one of the challenges of the minimal approach is that it really depends on the method of measurement that you use. So it's really important to think that through. So that is why we recommend just looking at the changes over time rather than comparing the cost of healthy and unhealthy food. Of course, you can do that with diets, which we'll talk about further. So if you look at, for example, vegetables, which is the green bar in this graph, you will see that if you look at the cost of vegetables per 100 calories, they're the most expensive food group. But if you look at the cost per average portion, they are moderately priced. And so it really makes a difference how you, the method of measurement that you use as to what answer you get. So this is the research that I have done looking at the New Zealand Food Price Index, just to show you an example of what it can look like. We've looked at the change in price over time for healthier, which is the lighter coloured bar, and unhealthy food. And so what we were looking at was what is the difference in the trend. And you can see that in more recent years, or 2020, 2021, that the price of healthy food was increasing at a higher rate than the price of unhealthy food, which is obviously of concern. Often with healthy food, there is of course more seasonal fluctuations because that encompasses the fruit and vegetables. So there are different ways of looking at the optimal approach, and one of the most common ways of doing this is a market basket approach. And this is where you create one healthy and one habitual or current diet based on national recommendations, and for the habitual diet based on the, say, a nutrition survey, consumption data, or maybe a household budget survey. Collect food prices and then calculate the diet cost. Now, this is a relatively easy way of monitoring prices over time, as long as you've got the information to inform your market baskets. But it does mean that you've only got one cost per basket. And so that just reflects the foods that you've chosen to put in the basket, which are commonly consumed foods. So there has been some work to develop what we call a diet cost program, which models combination of common foods to provide diets, so that instead of just comparing the cost of one diet against another, you compare the cost of a number of healthy diets with a range of different combinations and compare that to a range of costs of current diets or whatever other diets you're looking at. And we have done this in New Zealand, looking at greenhouse gas emissions, and Mexico recently have used the diet cost program as well. And then I'm going to talk a little bit more about how we've done that in New Zealand later when I talk about sustainability. So moving on to using the household expenditure survey. So this is, of course, the household expenditure survey is at a household level, and so this needs to be converted for household members. And Argentina have done some work on this, and you can see the publication there where they did that. Instead of using diet cost, they used linear programming and Monte Carlo simulation. So now I'm going to pass over to Merryn to talk about the work that has been done in Australia as an example of using the optimal approach.
Thanks, Sally. Yes, the Australian Healthy Diets, Australian Standardised Affordability and Pricing, or ASAP protocol, is an example of the optimal approach where a habitual and a healthy diet are created. So the picture on the left shows the foods that represent the habitual diet, which is what an average family of 4 report eating over a fortnight. You can see about half the picture is unhealthy foods, which is why this is sometimes called the unhealthy diet. And it also includes some alcohol and takeaway foods as well. Then the picture on the right is the healthy diet, which is created by removing all the unhealthy food and drinks from the habitual diet and increasing the amounts of healthy foods to match the Australian Dietary Guidelines recommendations. So it's a minimal change healthy diet. The healthy diet is also, just point out, a bit more sustainable as its production creates 25% less greenhouse gas emissions than the production of the habitual diet. And next, please, Sally. So here's some typical results. Next slide, please, Sally. Typical results from Healthy Diets ASAP showing the cost of the habitual diet in the left-hand column there. You'll see within that column the red toned sections. That represents the cost of the unhealthy food and drinks, and it's about 60% of the total cost, which is showing us just how much money is at stake for the corporations that produce these foods and the power of those commercial determinants of health. Then the recommended or the healthy diet cost, the column on the right, and that's about 15 to 20% less than the habitual diet cost. But while this costs less than the habitual diet, the healthy diet is still unaffordable for low-income families, such as those who are reliant on welfare. So our standardised protocol includes the pricing tools, sampling and price collection protocols, and income calculation protocols. And it can and has indeed been modified for population groups, including Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander groups in Australia, and also for low socioeconomic groups. Next slide, please. So in this example, we were looking at the influence of regionality and distance on the price of food. So the protocol was applied across Queensland, which is the second largest state in Australia. So this chart shows just the cost of the healthy diets with 3 levels of disadvantage across the x-axis, then 3 levels of remoteness on the z-axis going into the screen. So we found that the cost of the healthy diets was at least 30% higher in our very remote areas in the north and west of the state compared to the urban areas in southeastern Queensland. So the protocol was able to show that rurality was the dominant determinant of food price and was much more important than area disadvantage. Next slide, please. So using the protocol to measure affordability enabled us to show how additional welfare payments that the Australian government provided during the COVID pandemic meant that for the first time, the healthy diets were affordable. That is, it became less than 30% of household income required to purchase them. But with the decrease and then removal of these payments, the healthy diets once again became unaffordable for welfare recipients. So this shows how the protocol can model changes in income effective affordability of healthy food. Next slide, please. This example shows the application of the original Healthy Diets ASAP protocol and also the modified version for low socioeconomic groups for 3 different households. So in the low socioeconomic group version, the prices are taken from the cheapest available option, which is often a generic branded item, and also the amounts of each item in the habitual diet are corresponded to reported intakes from the lowest income quintile. So application of the low socioeconomic version results in diet costs that are about 36% lower for the habitual diet and 31% lower for the recommended diet, which means that the differential between the 2 diets becomes less. And for some households, such as the single parent household shown in the middle section, the recommended diet actually became a little bit more expensive than the habitual diet. So this might help to explain the common perception that healthy foods are expensive. Next slide, please. In order to calculate food costs, access to prices is of course necessary. And traditionally, prices have been collected from supermarkets and retail settings, either in person or more recently from online shopping websites where they are available. As Sally mentioned earlier, some countries such as New Zealand have a food price index, which can be a source of prices. There's also home scan panel data from Nielsen as another option, although this usually incurs a cost to access it. Or there might also be a food price database such as can be found in the USA. Next slide, please. Other approaches to price collection which are being considered include in Australia a price tracker database. So this scrapes data from online sources of 2 major Australian supermarkets. It includes regular and promoted prices, nutritional information, and regular updates of the product images. In more rural and remote settings where online price data is not available, the citizen science approach can be used, particularly where there's strong community interest in the cost of food and food pricing. So in Australia, this has been done with the Country Women's Association in Queensland and local undernal data collectors in remote community settings. So I'll now hand back to Sally.
Thank you, Merryn. So I'm now going to talk about recent work to add measures of environmental impact. So in Latin America, there's an IDRC grant that Informis has to explore different methods to assess the cost of healthy and sustainable diets. And I'll talk more about that. In New Zealand, we have used diet costs to compare the cost and affordability of healthy and less healthy current diets, and also some different measures of sustainability. So the Latin American work is in progress at the moment. So I'm just going to talk about the methods because the results are underway at the moment. So we had 3 different countries, Mexico, Brazil, and Argentina, who approached this in the best way for their country, depending on what data was available. So they all had a range of diet scenarios. They all had a current diet. They all had a healthy diet that was based on their dietary guidelines. But note that the Mexican and Brazilian dietary guidelines incorporate sustainability. So that diet is a healthy and sustainable one. They all had a diet modelled on Eat Lancet recommendations. And then Mexico and Argentina had some additional scenarios, as you can see there. Mexico and Argentina had recent national nutrition surveys for their source of dietary data to come up with the diet scenarios, and Brazil used their household budget survey. And they all added environmental measures, all added carbon. And in Mexico and Brazil, where there was more information available, they looked at land use, blue water, and ecological footprint. One of the challenges of adding environmental impact is finding country-specific data, but there are international databases as well. And with the growing interest in environmental measures, hopefully there will be more data available at a country level or a regional level that countries can use to look at this. In Mexico and Brazil, they have used the diet cost tool, and in Argentina, Monte Carlo simulation. And so hopefully they will all be publishing results from their studies in the next year. So in New Zealand, we had a master's student, Bruce Kidd, who used diet cost to look at the cost of sustainable and healthy diets. So he had 4 scenarios, a current and a healthy, a flexitarian, which was based on Eat Lancet, and a vegan diet. He also looked at the greenhouse gas emissions for each of these scenarios. Now, if you look at the bottom table, table 3, not surprisingly, the vegan diet was more sustainable, or the most sustainable, and the current, the least sustainable. So that all went in the direction as expected. What we perhaps were slightly surprised about was that the cost of the fortnightly diet scenarios, as they became more sustainable, they also became more costly. But because we were using the diet cost program, we did note that there was quite a range of costs within each of the diets. So even though the vegan diets ended up being more expensive, perhaps because of some of the plant-based alternatives that were in those diets, such as a vegan cheese, there were cheaper options within that range. And so what we looked at was, so what we decided was that there is more than one healthy diet, there is a range of costs, but we do need to be careful when we're recommending for people to move to more sustainable diets, that there are affordable options available to them. So if you're thinking about the approach that your research team can use, there are some questions that you need to ask. You need to think about what are the sources of the price data. As Merryn outlined, there is a wide range of price sources that you can use. You need to think about what are the guidelines in your country for healthy food and a healthy diet. And you need to think about, is there food consumption data to help you build those diet scenarios? And many countries do not have recent nutrition surveys, so you would need to think, are there other options, such as a household expenditure survey? Need to think about the sources of environmental impact data, and if you don't have local data, whether global data would be useful. Probably what I should have said first is, what are your policy questions? What are you trying to answer? Because there are different ways of looking and monitoring the cost of food prices and diets. And so you really need to know, what are you asking first? And then, of course, what time, resources, and expertise are available. So we have a food prices module leadership team we represent most continents around the world, and we meet about 3 times a year. If you are interested and want some support to have some food prices or food diet work in your country, please contact Merryn or I, and we can put you in touch with some people that might be able to help. So thank you for listening.